Welcome back to Language of the Soul, Conversations on Healing and Growth. I'm Ben Umstead.
And I'm Martin Perkins.
So, Martin, I'm going to be coming to visit you at Simplicity Farm this coming weekend. And there's always a certain level of excitement that I get coming to visit. I've known Simplicity since it was even, before it was called that. And there's just a really nourishing quality to coming to walking the land and by extension going to the parkland beyond. I think one of the most impactful things for me is when I encounter non-human animals, whether it's that time that we were tracking the flight of an eagle on a walk or, hearing about some of the fox encounters. I only had one encounter with a fox myself many, many years ago. There's always such a simple, soft quality that I feel in those encounters to engage with just the moment as it is, as this other living mammal or bird comes across my path and we kind of share a moment that is unspeakable in many ways. This is something as a visitor that's really special to me, and it's a part of why I enjoy coming and spending time with you and Bear and just spending time on the land itself. I wanted to ask you about just your experiences day in and day out being there. It must be very different from my experiences as a visitor.
The notion of visiting versus being per se a steward, and that's how I hold my role. I'm a steward here. I don't care much for the notion that I own this land, or in the case or context of this notion that I'm a pet owner. I love the Hawaiian concept of, and I'm hopefully pronouncing this correctly, kahu, which the word kahu is the Hawaiian word for the person who cares for, who is the steward, who's in relationship with the dog, and that you're a guardian, you're a caretaker, you're a partner with the dog. And with Bear and I, because we spend literally 24/7 together, it very much feels like we're mutually taking care of this place. And, his role he sees as being a guardian of the land, and mine in a different context feels that way. Like, I have the good fortune of having people in my life who are very, very knowledgeable about the natural world and can identify mushrooms and tree species and all kinds of different biologic presences, everything from, different fungi to like just everything that exists in the natural world. They can identify it. And while I'm better with identifying trees and different, mosses and such, I'm not really oriented that way. It's more of a heartfelt connection that I feel with the natural world. It's more of a spiritual connection where seeing a red-bellied woodpecker really holds a heart-centered, a soul-centered place in me. And I often will research. I want to learn about the sounds that they make or their behavioral traits. In general, it's more of a, what do we need? What are we learning from each other? What's the mutual connection that's there? Luna and I, Luna being my daughter, have been talking a great deal about the notion of intersectionality. In particular, our conversations have been centered around the movie Origin, which I recently had the good fortune to see in the theater, and some of the work that Luna's done in classes such as anthropology and other classes, and this notion of intersectionality where humans often attribute it to a human to human intersectionality. And for me, it extends well beyond that, that there's a kind of intersectionality for me between myself and everything that I connect to here at Simplicity Farm.
It's a really wonderful way of being in the world, and it's not really only looking at it, but like you noted, that really heartfelt sense. when you encounter something as, I think, more rare with a red-bellied woodpecker, what comes up for you? I know there is a really particular encounter that we've been tiptoeing towards here that was really special. I'd love to hear what that energy was, how you really saw that moment with this particular bird.
Right. And so to be clear up front, seeing a red-bellied woodpecker actually isn't a rare instance. It's actually an extremely common bird. It's a smaller woodpecker, so therefore it's not as noticeable, and it's certainly a much more common occurrence than, say, seeing a pileated woodpecker, which is a much larger bird and less likely to be seen in one's saunters through the forest. But the particular experience that I'd like to reference is an instance where I was doing some tree work for my neighbor, some tree trimming. As we walked up to a particular maple, a red-bellied woodpecker landed just a few feet away from us, which is not that common. They, like all birds, they're not necessarily just going to like put themselves in close proximity to humans. But this woodpecker just lands just a few feet away from us and turns and looks and pauses and looks directly at us and then stays there for a sustained period of time and then eventually flies off. And it was very much the sense of pay attention. This experience occurred just prior to me beginning to watch the TV show Echo, which is what ultimately prompted a kind of deeper exploration into this relationship with a red-bellied woodpecker.
So the TV show Echo is adaptation of a Marvel Comics character, and it's pretty significant. I know that you were listening to an NPR podcast that talked about the show, and I have not having viewed it myself. Could you set it up for us what that significance is, why it's so different from what typically we're seeing from the Marvel movies and shows now?
Well, two primary facets. The first being that the protagonist is female and she's Native American. She's a Choctaw. And there's a really lovely NPR feature that I had seen where they interviewed indigenous people who there was a preview of the show, of the first episode. It was exclusively an audience of Native people and their excitement, and it wasn't just adults, but there was lots of kids going, there's a woman like me who's a superhero, right? And I was like very excited about that. So it did very much pique my interest because in a general sense, I don't gravitate toward Marvel TV shows and movies. They named the show not after the female protagonist, whose name is Maya, but rather they named it Echo. In Choctaw storytelling, there's a creation story. And in that creation story, there are stone people who live beneath or within this mound. They are, in essence, energetic beings, is how I would hold it. At least that's how it's depicted in the show. And the red-bellied woodpecker appears to these beings and serves as this catalytic moment where, in essence, the mound transforms into the world above. So from deep within, a new world arises, and it's catalyzed by the presence of this red-bellied woodpecker. The individual leading these stone beings is a woman, and it is the echo of this first woman that expresses itself in Maya. So there's this notion of, I would hold, ancient knowledge, ancient wisdom, this passing down of soulfulness in the form of wisdom that's passed down generation after generation after generation. It's a really beautiful counter or juxtaposition with the other theme in the show, which is generational healing, generational wounds. You know, Maya in the show, she's dealing with a lot of wounds. There's a lot of violence that's been in her life. There's been a lot of loss. Interspersed with this is this, as the show goes on, this recognition on her part that there's some part of her that's inherently wise, that I would offer is that's the nature of the soul. Our souls are inherently the wise part of us, and that Maya experiences this echo of wisdom. For me, growing up in the 60s, that felt absent, that echo of wisdom, you know. And so the two superheroes per se that I turned to, that I saw as sort of worthy or inspirational to me, came from Asian and indigenous culture, right? So I was reading about indigenous leaders from days past. I was appreciating the presence of Kato within the show The Green Hornet, who seemed to me to be the real hero of the show, because he was always like there in that time of need, in the same way that Maya shows up in the show Echo.
There's this sense with a lot of the Marvel movies and shows about the big set pieces and the action and what can come down to fisticuffs, essentially. So I'm curious about how she ends up transforming this place that's often, rife with violence. There's strife there. And yet here she is with this deep, soulful wisdom that you've noted, and something else starts to take shape.
Right. So there's, and you know, we're at that spoiler alert moment. She actually does, as a younger person, she shoots Wilson Fisk. He survives her attempt to remove him from her life, because he's this very dark presence, this very controlling presence. And it's the direct result of her having learned that Wilson had killed her own father. So out of revenge, she attempts to kill Wilson and finds out that in fact she failed. He reappears, and he's pretty committed to this notion that he can bring her back into the fold. He sees her for her extraordinary talent and in essence wants to control it through his unresolved wounds. He wants to take his own generational wounding and in essence use her as the tool through which he will seek greater and greater states of wealth and power. And it's at this particular pivotal moment, as he's actually given up the idea that he can turn her to his will. And instead, there's this moment where she lets go into the echo of her wisdom. This moment occurs where he's seeking to have a violent battle with her, and instead she comes over, she places her hands on his head, and they, as well as we the viewer, are brought back to the moment where for Wilson this all begins, which is his response to his father's violence against his mother, and the moment where he takes a ball peen hammer and kills his father. And she, in essence, challenges him not to kill his father, to make another choice. And then, without actually seeing whether or not he makes that different choice or not, we're back forward in time, and Wilson is on his knees. He's been shaken, transformed by this experience, and he's shouting, "What did you do to me? What did you do to me?" Because he's been placed at this incredibly vulnerable place. Vulnerability being such a potent tool for healing. And we don't know, what happens with Wilson. Does he choose to heal this generational trauma? We don't know, but at the very least, he's giving that opportunity. There's this vulnerability and this recognition that by her being vulnerable with him, something has shifted in her, right? Which is a very potent symbol of the divine feminine. To use both healing, to use vulnerability as a way to heal generational trauma.
Her empowerment of making a different choice with this divine feminine. Can you speak more to that?
Well, first and foremost, I'm not talking about gender. And I want to repeat that. I'm not talking about gender. I'm talking about an energetic quality that exists within all of us. It exists within the deep stillness of our being. It emanates from the silence of our being. That is the nature of the divine feminine. Now, it has a multitude of expressions, and I'm not here to judge how it expresses, but it often gets connected in the popular culture with this notion that today's woman can have it all. And what it really seems to be connected to is this idea that today's woman can be all things for all people. And I feel like at times there's a forgetting of what does she need to be for herself. In other words, it's an extension of a kind of mothering energy. It's either the old model of, be a mother, and they've taken the old model of being a mother, or you can be this professional. Now we're going to put the two together, and that makes you more complete. Instead of redefining the whole thing in the first place, like redefining this notion of what it means to be a man or a woman, because men have our own version of it, right? Of this very old and very, unfortunately, very misogynistic notion of what it means to be male, to be the provider, the protector. While those qualities can be significant, they don't need to define who we are. There's deeper drivers within us that call us not to a set role, but rather, how are we called to heal? How are we called to grow in this life?
It really sounds like one of the reasons why you resonated with Maya and her journey, or at least the part of her journey that was depicted in the series, was making choices for herself, and that there are these effects, and one could argue the echo of that inner wisdom that she holds does come to the outside world, as we see with her interaction, her engagement, her nonviolent engagement with Wilson Fisk. When we see that kind of tension between ourselves in real life, let's take this outside of the context of the show. Often, how we define each other in different roles, and nemesis is such a potent word. Have you had moments in your life where there is that just driving force within you that wants to name someone, that wants to shape someone as a nemesis? And if so, where has that softening and reshaping come from?
The most significant relationship that I've learned to do that with is with my mother. For much of my life would have defined her. I may not have used the word nemesis, but there was definitely an opposition that was always present between the two of us. With her death over 20 years ago, and the work that I've done over the years in, number one, first acknowledging the true nature of what, and not hiding from what actually occurred between the two of us. In other words, unpacking all of the shadow pieces that she was responsible for, that I was responsible for, that we shared together, this dance of a kind of ongoing battle that we had with each other. Ultimately, as I grieved and then ultimately forgave, and defining forgiveness as giving up all hope for a better yesterday, I gave up the notion that there would ever be a better relationship between the two of us, something else arose, which was a very unexpected and frankly extraordinary gift. And that was as I gave up my own sense of seeking through my grief of battling with her, an actual great sense of gratitude arose in me from the recognition that we had done this dance, this decades long dance of conflict. And from this place that I cultivated in myself and I continue to practice with, I was able to find in myself this gratitude, this sense of my mother went through so much pain. We went through this pain together so that a healing could arise, a growth could arise in me that is frankly just not that common. Most people never get to the point where they can be grateful on a soul level for the sacrifice that my mother made in order for this moment and these moments to arise in me since. The notion of being grateful for it only arises though after years of grieving, of unpacking and grieving and unpacking to the point where I wasn't carrying it with me in the same way.
Hmm. Really embracing all of that and knowing that there's a depth to reality and thus the sacrifice and the gratitude for that sacrifice becomes something potent rather than just an idea or a cognitive understanding. I think that's often where people leave it, and it's on that precipice of transformation.
Many people avoid the first step. The first step being unpacking all of one's own shadows and the shadows that one experiences in relation to the other. You know, in my case, it was an example, not exclusively just this one, but a primary one was for many years, an unwillingness on my part to acknowledge the physical violence, the beatings from my mother that I hid from. I didn't want to take them out because then what would that mean? Less so about how I would see her, but rather I just didn't want to deal with the pain that was there. An unwillingness on my part by not unpacking it, it became the generational trauma that became a central part of my relationships. And it was really the recognition that I couldn't continue to do that anymore, that I couldn't pass down that generational trauma to my own children in the ways that I had already begun to do.
It really gets to that point of quite simply making a different choice.
Right, and the consequences of that choice. And I want to be very clear that when I say I had begun to do, I had been doing, and that it had had effect on many of my relationships.
Tying that back to Echo, really Maya's journey, Maya's story, I'm hearing that that was a big part of why this superhero narrative that had been so separate from your experience as a viewer and as a reader and lover of story, of history, why this resonated for you in such I just hear how potent it is. And I mean, I think that's something significant there because you're not coming from that that community and that culture. You have a extraordinary reverence and love and allyship for that community and culture, but to resonate with it on a human scale is, I mean, for me as a storyteller, I go, that's, that's the special sauce. That's what we're all, really wanting to do, to offer resonance, to offer empathy, no matter where the person, the viewer, is coming from, no matter where the character that is being presented is coming from. It's greater empathy.
Right. The notion that compassion, empathy, deep listening to the experiences of others, deep listening to one's own messages and soul messages that one is receiving if one is practicing with this. So like it wasn't just that, a red-bellied woodpecker appeared. It was that an NPR radio feature had such resonance. It was that at a certain point on my Hulu screen, it was like, oh, there it is. There's Echo, right? So there's all these kind of synergies that I was listening into. And it's listening to that and following it, allowing for spirit to lead you, having enough space in one's life so that it isn't so filled that these kinds of messages get drowned out.
That's it for our show today. If you'd like to engage more with Language of the Soul, there is the course that Martin offers virtually, in person, in a group setting, and now one-to-one. There's also the book, Language of the Soul, A Path of Simplicity. A lot of the language that we're using today has been cultivated through many different years of experience and practice into this book, and that is currently available on martinperkins.com. MartinPerkins.com.